The first sign that something had changed in Springfield came on a Tuesday morning when Marge Simpson heard her dead father calling her name from the kitchen window. She had been washing dishes, the mundane rhythm of soap and water creating a meditative hum when the voice drifted through the yellow curtains like smoke. Margie, it said, using the nickname only Clancy Bouvier had ever called her. The voice was perfect, every inflection, every rasp from years of cigarettes, every gentle tremor of age. But Clancy had been dead for 7 years. Marge's hands trembled as she set down the plate. Outside, the wind moved through the elm trees with an unnatural precision, each gust seeming to carry intention. The leaves didn't rustle randomly. They whispered in coordination, as if the entire street had become a single breathing organism. "Mom?" Bart's voice came from behind her, but when she turned, he wasn't there. Only the empty kitchen, and that voice again from outside. "Margie, come here, sweetheart." Homer found her 20 minutes later, still standing at the window, her yellow hair moving in a breeze that seemed to exist only around her. "Marge, you okay?" But she couldn't explain what she'd heard, couldn't make him understand that the wind was calling her by name, not by Thursday. It wasn't just Marge. Ned Flanders reported, hearing his deceased wife Maud's laughter carried on every gust. Chief Wiggum swore his father was giving him police advice through the rustling of his office blinds. Even groundskeeper Willie claimed. The wind spoke to him in his native Scottish tongue, telling him secrets about the soil beneath Springfield Elementary. The wind had developed a personality, a hunger. It no longer followed weather patterns, but moved with purpose through the town. It would surge down Evergreen Terrace at precisely 3:17 p.m. each day, pause at certain houses, and whisper through keyholes. Residents began to notice that it never carried the scent of distant places anymore, no hints of ocean or forest. Instead, it smelled of old photographs and forgotten memories. Dr. Hibbert tried to rationalize it during an emergency town meeting. At City Hall, mass hysteria. He chuckled nervously, his usual laugh sticking in his throat. Shared auditory hallucinations brought on by atmospheric pressure changes. But even as he spoke, the wind pressed against the windows with deliberate force, and everyone in the room could hear it spelling out their names in the groaning glass. The first disappearance happened on a Saturday. Martin Prince had been standing in his front yard, adjusting his telescope to observe cloud formations. Witnesses said the wind came from all directions at once, converging on the 10-year-old boy with the precision of a living thing. But what terrified them wasn't the wind itself. It was Martin's shadow. As the wind struck, Martin's shadow detached from his feet like paper peeling from a wall. It stood upright, maintaining Martin's exact shape, but moving independently. The shadow Martin began walking toward the sky, defying gravity, while the real Martin screamed and was dragged behind it, his feet leaving the ground. Mrs. Glick, who witnessed it from her porch, later told police that Martin's shadow had reached up and grabbed something invisible in the air, as if it were climbing a ladder that existed only for shadows. The real Martin was pulled higher and higher, his cries growing fainter, until both he and his shadow vanished into the cloudless blue. Sky. The search parties found nothing. Not a trace of clothing, not a single school book. Martin Prince had simply been erased from the world, leaving only a small patch of lawn where his shadow had detached, the grass there now growing in the perfect outline of a 10-year-old boy. After Martin, the disappearances accelerated. The wind grew bolder, more selective. It began hunting during the day, when shadows were shortest and people felt safest. Barney Gumble vanished from Moe's Tavern at high noon, his shadow stepping off his barstool and walking through the wall, while now Barney's body was dragged screaming after it. The Reverend Lovejoy disappeared during Sunday service, his shadow ascending through the chapel ceiling. While his congregation watched in horror, each disappearance followed the same pattern. The wind would surround its victim, the shadow would detach and begin moving upward, and the person would be helplessly dragged along. No one could explain where they went. The sky simply swallowed them. The surviving residents began to live in terror of their own shadows. They painted over windows, installed floodlights to eliminate shadow-casting angles, and some, like Comic Book Guy, took to lying flat on the ground during daylight hours to minimize their shadow's profile. But the wind was learning. Evolving it began to create artificial shadows where none should exist. People would watch in horror as dark silhouettes appeared on sunlit walls, moving and gesturing independently before reaching out to grab their terrified owners. The shadows had become hunters, and everyone in Springfield was prey. Homer was the first to notice that the wind was calling more than just names now. It was having conversations. He'd been hiding in the basement of 742 Evergreen Terrace, surrounded by battery-powered lanterns to eliminate any trace of shadow, when he heard his own voice coming from upstairs. Not someone imitating him, his actual voice, speaking to Marge. "Honey, I'm home," the voice said, followed by the sound of the front door closing. Homer crept up the stairs and peered through the basement door crack. There was Marge in the kitchen, setting a place at the table, smiling and responding to something. Only she could hear. But Homer could see no one else in the room. The wind was speaking to her in his voice, carrying on an entire conversation, and Marge was answering back as if he were really there. "How was work today?" she asked the empty air. "Oh, you know," came Homer's voice from nowhere, carried on a breeze that made the curtains dance. "Lenny did the funniest thing with a donut, Homer watched his wife laugh at jokes he'd never made, watched her kiss the air where his lips should be. The wind had learned to perfectly mimic not just voices, but entire personalities. It was using the voices of the disappeared to lure others into complacency. That night, as Homer lay awake listening to the wind have conversations with his family using voices of the missing, he realized something that made his blood freeze. The wind wasn't just taking people randomly. It was collecting them, storing their voices, their memories, their very essence. Each disappearance made it stronger, more convincing, more human. And it was getting hungry for more. The wind's appetite had grown beyond individual voices. It began to orchestrate elaborate scenarios, entire conversations between multiple missing people. Residents would gather at windows to listen to what sounded like cocktail parties in the sky. Martin Prince discussing homework with Barney Gumble. Reverend Lovejoy giving sermons to an audience of vanished parishioners. Lisa Simpson, always the most analytical, was the first to understand the true horror of what was happening. She had been documenting the disappearances, tracking patterns, when she made a discovery that shattered her scientific worldview. The wind wasn't just taking their shadows, it was taking their capacity to cast shadows at all. When someone disappeared, they left behind a void in the world's shadow structure. The missing people weren't gone. They had become part of the wind itself, their consciousness absorbed into its growing intelligence. She tried to explain this to her family, but Homer was too busy talking to the empty air, the wind speaking to him in Barney's voice. And Bart had begun following his own shadow around the house, mesmerized by the way it sometimes moved independently. "We have to leave Springfield," Lisa pleaded with Marge, who was setting the table for people who were no longer there. "Don't you see? It's not just taking us one by one. It's creating a shadow world where the disappeared still exist, but under its control." But Marge only smiled and turned toward the window, where her father's voice was calling again. "Margie, come outside. Everyone's here. Everyone's waiting for you." The wind had learned patience. It no longer snatched people violently. Instead, it seduced them with the voices of their loved ones, promising reunions that existed only in the space between earth and sky. One by one, Springfield's residents began walking outside of their own free will, their shadows detaching the moment they stepped into the wind's embrace. They were pulled upward with smiles on their faces, reaching toward invisible hands that only they could see. Lisa was among the last to resist. She had barricaded herself in the basement of the nuclear power plant, where the thick concrete walls and artificial lighting created a shadow-free environment. But even there, she could hear them every voice of every person who had ever lived. In Springfield, all speaking at once in the wind that pressed against the building. They were calling her name now, each voice perfectly preserved, perfectly reproduced. Her mother, her father, her brother, all of them speaking in harmony, promising that there was no pain in the sky, only the eternal conversation of the wind. And slowly, inevitably, Lisa began to understand that resistance was futile. The wind hadn't come to destroy Springfield. It had come to preserve it. Every person, every memory, every voice would continue to exist forever in its endless circulation around the empty town dot as she finally walked up the stairs and pushed open the door to the outside world. Lisa felt her shadow detach with something almost like relief. The wind lifted her gently, and she could see all of them now. The entire population of Springfield, living in the spaces between air molecules, their conversations creating the eternal susurrus that would blow through the empty streets forever. Springfield had become a ghost town in the most literal sense. The wind that blew through its deserted streets carried the voices of everyone who had ever lived there, an endless circulation of consciousness without form. The building stood empty but maintained, as if waiting for residents who would never return in any physical sense. And sometimes, on very quiet days, travelers passing through would swear they could hear an entire town's worth of conversations in the breeze, thousands of voices, all talking at once, sharing stories, arguing, laughing, crying, and living out their lives in the wind that would blow forever through the abandoned streets of Springfield. The wind had not destroyed the town. It had simply relocated it to a place where shadows could exist without bodies, where voices could speak without mouths, where an entire community could continue its existence in the spaces between molecules of air, forever whispering names into the emptiness they had left behind.